Okay, I think it's 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and have a very prompt start time. Hi, everyone joining us through YouTube, through Zoom, all the different platforms. I just want to thank you for being here with us today, and a very special thank you to our distinguished panelists who will be engaging in this much anticipated discussion. My name is Samin. I'm the president of the Middle East and North Africa Club this year, and we're excited to be hosting this event in partnership with SAIS Middle East faculty. We're so excited to conclude our incredible semester with this very important topic and our very insightful panelists. This event will be running about an hour and a half, and in just a second, I'm going to pass this off to Dr. Hintz, who will be our moderator and introduce our esteemed panel. We're going to be reserving time at the end for audience questions, so please put those in the YouTube chat and we'll go ahead and distribute those as well. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Liesl Hintz, Assistant Professor of International Relations and European Studies at SAIS. She will be our moderator and take us from here. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Samin, and thank you to everyone for joining us from the US, Turkey, and beyond. It really is my pleasure to be able to host this panel today, and I want to thank and commend the SAIS MENA Club for all the fantastic work that they have done this term in terms of putting together events. We've had some restrictions, but you've made it an incredible semester full of really great discussions. So I want to thank Samin and Hayden and Aydin and everybody else who has worked so hard to make these events possible. I am extremely excited to host this panel. I always say that it's a timely occasion to be talking about Turkish politics, domestic politics, and foreign policy. And oh my goodness, we've got so much to talk about today. And I also tell my students that irrespective of which sort of issue that you're fascinated by, whether it's democratization and democratic backsliding, NATO dynamics, civil military relations, political Islam, refugees, unorthodox monetary policy, Turkey's your country. It's an incredible empirical window onto so many of these fascinating dynamics, and we've got lots to talk about today. So I'm thrilled to be joined by a truly, I agree with Samin, truly distinguished panel of experts. So I want to introduce them briefly. I will start off the discussion by a broad question that I'm going to pose to all of the panelists, and then I'll follow up with some specific questions for each of them. So joining us today, we have Aslı Aydın Taşbaş, who is a prolific journalist, Washington Post contributor, and fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. We have Sibel Oktay, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Illinois at Springfield. She's also an author of a forthcoming book on coalitions and foreign policy entitled Governing Abroad. We have Sinan Ciddi, who is an associate professor of security studies at Marine Corps University. He's also an adjunct associate professor at Georgetown University, where he teaches on Turkish domestic politics and foreign policy. We have Sinan Ülgen, so two Sinans today, who is a former Turkish diplomat, chairman of the Istanbul-based think tank Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, and also a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Europe in Brussels. And finally, we have Seren Selvin Korkmaz, who is the co-founder and executive director of Istanbul, another think tank looking at democracy, social development, foreign policy. She's also a lecturer at Stockholm University and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. So I wasn't lying when I said we have a whole lot of expertise here today. All right, so I want to start off the discussion, as I said, with a pretty broad question that I'll pose to each of the panelists. And I'll start with Aslı Aydın Taşbaş first. So I'd like each of you to sort of reflect on how do we characterize the current state of US-Turkish relations? How do we understand this? What are the main sources of tension, or maybe what do you see as sort of the key point of contestation in those relations? And we can sort of build on the discussion as each panelist responds. So Aslı, I'd love to start with you.
Hi, Liesl. Thank you for inviting me, and a great lineup here with my colleagues. You're right. We are a country that lurches from crisis to crisis, and this week is not a crisis about Turkish-US relations, but 2 weeks ago we had that when Ankara threatened to PNG the US ambassador. But to your question, the state of Turkish-US relations, bad, but manageable. Manageable, I need to qualify that as a low bar. That is to say, trying to prevent any crises in the bilateral relationship, diplomatic spats, and so on and so forth. So to the extent that your goal for this year is avoiding huge fallouts, that's manageable. In terms of the quality of the relationship, it's a shell of what it used to be. It is technically an alliance, but in reality, there's a lot of there's a number of problems, both structurally and actually diplomatic issues between the two countries. I think Biden administration came into office with the idea of cold shouldering the current Turkish government, because they felt that they had issues with democratic backsliding. They had issues with things like Turkey's purchase of S-400s. They also wanted to make a clear break with the Trump administration, where the chemistry between the bromance between Erdoğan and Trump had created this fake good vibe, but relations were deteriorating. And 6 months of cold shouldering, I think, to an extent has worked. It has worked in the sense that if you are, as a couple, if you're fighting and if you decide to sleep in separate bedrooms, you don't fight at night because you're in separate bedrooms. This is the type of situation we have now, but structural problems remain. Turkey does want to pursue strategic autonomy, and at least the current Turkish government does not necessarily see itself as a card-carrying member of the NATO community. Therefore, the S-400 issue, I hope Sinan can explain that further, because there are also steps to de-escalate, and so it's not everyone, but clearly what's been happening, it's not everyone in the Turkish system, but clearly President Erdoğan does want to see Turkey as a great power in an age of great power competition, and does not necessarily agree that NATO partners can tell Turkey what weapon systems to buy from Russia and what not to buy. So there's that whole element structurally, a country that feels it's equal and wants to pursue strategic autonomy, and still a transatlantic club that has its rules. Second issue, we have things like Halkbank, we have things like the fact that 3 US consular employees are still going through, 1 in jail and 2, I think, are under house arrest. I don't think that is the case in any country. And then there's the third big issue, which is democracy. Whatever one thinks of Biden administration's efforts in promoting democracy, I know that some people think that's not enough. It falls short of the expectations, but it is a word that is out there in the public domain in global politics, and Turkey clearly falls short of any sort of criteria that is that one would want, at least for in terms of the list of democratic countries. There has been no progress on these issues, and while President Erdoğan clearly wants to have a good relationship with President Biden and all, the way he really wants it is, I don't want to change anything. Will you love me the way I am? And I don't think the answer is yes. I think the answer is distance. The answer is we sleep in separate bedrooms. So that is how I would sum up the state of the relationship. And final word, maybe, I don't expect any movement on Turkey's external relations until Turkish elections, until 2023. I think everyone in Turkey certainly, but also in the outside world, people, countries and external countries are waiting to see what will happen in Turkey, whether or not there will be a post-Erdoğan period or it's going to be the same situation. So let me wrap up here.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I really appreciate you touching on issues of democracy. One of the things that I'm always trying to force into my students, but into my own work, is the interplay between domestic politics and foreign policy, and we'll talk quite a bit about that today. So, on that, Seren, I want to turn to you as someone who closely studies issues of de-democratization, authoritarian consolidation in Turkey. What are some of those key issues or key concerns that Aslı mentioned?
Thank you, Liesel. Actually, yes, Aslı mentioned the general broad issues between the US and Turkey, and it is clear that Turkey has experienced major institutional, political, and social transformation in the last decade, and the country has undergone dramatic autocratization under Erdoğan rule. And AKP and its leader actually have monopolized the power, undermined the democratic institution, suppressed civil society, and decent and committed violations of freedom of expression. As we all know, and also Aslı mentioned, in comparison to Trump administration, Biden attempted to include promoting democracy in the US and in the world. So it's really important. So promoting democratic principles has been included in foreign policy agenda. That is why actually it's challenge for both sides. First of all, I think Biden administration relations with an autocratic government that violates human rights, and also its strategic importance is challenged for the US because in somehow Biden need to balance this tension. For instance, after the meeting in Rome, the White House explained that Biden, in his talks with Erdoğan, emphasized that the importance of strong democratic institutions, respect for human rights, and the rule of law for peace and prosperity. This is what White House mentioned. But in Turkey, as in the case of Erdoğan, he utilizes these kinds of explanations as an external threat to Turkish democracy, as in the case of Erdoğan's threat to expel 10 foreign Western ambassadors, including the US representative, after their joint call for the release of imprisoned Turkish philanthropist Osman Kavala. So this is another side. So as a populist leader, Erdoğan targets external actors for domestic mobilization and depicts them as outsider, as the enemies who would like to in somehow interrupt Turkish domestic politics. So it's a violation of, he depicts that it's a violation of Turkish sovereignty in the domestic arena, and depicts himself as the leader who defends his country's interests and put Turkey as game setter in the international arena. So that's the issue. And another issue that I can say that about again the democratization issue is the Kavala issue, because Erdoğan, it seems that he don't want to actually get released the Kavala. And under the violation of these human rights in Turkey, I think this might create further tension. And another issue is related to HDP chairman, old chairman Demirtas, because this issue is another human rights issue in Turkey. So all of the political problems and this unjust imprisonment of main figures in Turkish society actually is related to democratization issue that we can see as a further tension between Turkey and the US. But Aslı mentioned that actually everyone wait for the elections in Turkey because we can see that in terms of the human rights and democracy under this government, there won't be any change. So all of the tensions that I mentioned, I think, cannot be solved without an election. And what I have seen in meetings in the Europe and in the US that I participate in, everyone just waiting for a change. We are also waiting for a change because there is a stability. But the problem is that an undemocratic country with still its strategic importance creates a problematic actually vision for the foreign policy, because Erdoğan uses foreign policy as a kind of instrument to mobilize his base at home. That's why we have unpredictable and uncertain foreign policy as well. And maybe we can also mention the economy issue, but both the economy and the foreign policy of Turkey is unpredictable, and without a further election, I think this tension will escalate even if the realistic strategic balance will continue.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So lots to unpack there that we'll dive into. I appreciate you bringing that up. So Sinan Ciddi, I want to turn to you. Aslı had mentioned that she would characterize the relationships as bad but manageable. Would you agree with that? Sort of what's your take on how US-Turkey relations look now, and what do you think the key sources of tensions are?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Good question. I was just thinking, part of it was related to your sort of pointing question, but also a reflection on some of the initial comments. Let me characterize it just one way. I have a colleague in the US intelligence community who's subsequently retired, and he's basically worked in the industry for 30 years. On a trip to Ankara in 2010, as part of the United States' liaison service, in terms of briefings for policy relating to Iran and what the United States was interested in sort of pursuing. Shortly prior to his departure, he was basically told to, not a verbatim quote, but the essential gist of the message was, don't tell the Turks that you wouldn't, anything that you wouldn't tell to the Pakistanis. That's 2010. We're now in 2021. And so the characterization of the relationship, it's to put it mildly at this point, and I apologize for the colloquialism, but it's a dumpster fire. It's beyond management. The management issue, I think, is just a facade at the surface level, on a day-to-day, trying to fend off any basic crisis that may or may not come about. That's the first observation I can put out there. And secondly, in the notion of sort of wandering around the halls of Washington, you know, speaking to colleagues either at the State Department or even sort of my neck of the woods, the Defense Department, there is nobody left. There is no untried or unturned stone as to, you know, what we should be doing. What have we not thought of to engage with the Turks? You know, what's left? What's worth preserving? There are a couple of individuals, Ambassador Jeffries on one level, and maybe, you know, a couple of other sort of retired personnel working behind the scenes, trying to sort of push the view that Turkey is too big to dump, based on sort of mutual US interests in the region. But, you know, you really have no pull. And finally, I would say is, just if you look at the perspective of the Turkish embassy, here in Washington, I just heard with the new ambassador the other day, that they're honestly thinking that, you know, that they're going to convince members of Congress to basically very much turn around this perception of Turkey. Key figures like Bob Menendez, who's apparently going to be susceptible to a bright sort of epiphany that Turkey can be trusted and workable, so we can actually, re-engage with Turkey. And they're spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on mediocre sort of lobbying institutions here to essentially try and sell an unsellable message, but also turn around the ship, which is all but sunk. And at this point, I agree with the earlier comment, there needs to be a change. And that's squarely on the Turkish end, because from the Biden administration's point of view, Turkey right now is best, you know, an annoyance, you know, that marginally has to sort of swat away like a mosquito if something comes up. But in the larger priority of the Biden administration's foreign policy, Turkey is really not that significant. And we kind of forget that in Turkish perspective. I mean, they're trying to re-engage with the Iranian negotiations. There's a democratization summit coming up, and as well as the sort of domestic agenda that the Biden administration is dealing with here. Turkey is not necessarily even in the top 20 priorities that the administration is facing here. So that's important to bear in mind, but just some initial reactions there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So we've got a little bit more of a pessimistic take from the DC perspective, perhaps. Really appreciate that insight. Sibel, I want to get your reactions to this in terms of where you see relations. Sinan mentioned that there's this democratization or democracy summit coming up. Turkey obviously wasn't invited. We know that that was seen as a big, a big blow. Sort of how would you characterize relations with your studies of foreign policy and diplomacy and so forth?
Right. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and good morning to all. So I agree with the pessimistic point of view, but I also think that if you start to look really closely about this sort of network of relationships between Turkey, NATO, and the United States, I think there is some opportunity for revival, and I hope I'll get to that, and we can hash that out in the Q&A. But I will characterize this relationship as a relationship of necessity. So going back to what Aslı said about this marriage where it's dysfunctional now, people are sleeping in separate bedrooms, but neither party has an incentive to go to couples therapy, right? So I think that's where we're at. I think it is still too costly for either party to call it off completely, and so we're in this sort of purgatory of relationship where it's not going to go in, I guess, either direction. It's going to exist in the standstill. I want to add just one thing that both Sinan and Seren said about, the only way that change could happen or improvement, change in the positive direction could happen would be a change in Turkish government, which has, I think it is. There's some validity to that, but I think the major elephant in the room is still the S-400, right? And the sanctions that followed. Can Turkey get a refund for its S-400s? Probably not. And so those batteries will stay, even with great likelihood, even after Erdoğan. And so that is just a tangible a tangible matter of fact that sort of obstructs the entirety of the relationship moving forward. So I think even though we see, if we see, Erdoğan will go, right? It's not a matter of whether, it's a matter of when. But even then, it will be a major problem for the next government and the next Turkish leadership to resolve. The other thing is obviously we'll get to that further, but going back to what Sinan said about Biden's domestic agenda and domestic politics in the US, not just Turkey, that is a major source of sort of tension for both countries. The F-16s, Turkey is already ousted from the F-35 deal. Now it's trying to modernize its F-16 fleet. Congress is obstructing that. Just recently, I think it was last week, when the representative from New Hampshire, in addition to a bunch of sort of interest groups, the American Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, they all sort of drafted this letter, sent it to the State Department saying, we want to see this letter of request. We want to assess it. We want to be able to say something about it as Congress. And so all of that is important for Biden to move forward with his own domestic agenda. And so, Turkey is in that sense in a very difficult position, because again, like Sinan very well, but it's not even in the top 20 list of priorities for the United States at this time. And so where Congress stands on this will be a major issue to be aware of. And I want to add that the midterm elections is coming up in the United States. And so, it's very likely that the Democrats will lose their majority in both House and their very slim majority in Senate. And so, that's going to put an even bigger burden on the president if he has any incentive of improving his relations, or the United States relations with Turkey. So I'll stop there, but I'm sure there's a lot to unpack in the remainder of this conversation.
There's always a lot to unpack. I really appreciate both you and Sinan pointing to the US domestic politics of this. So we see some maybe potential for change in the future, but obviously some sticking points that will remain, the S-400 being one of them. So that tees it up perfectly to shift to Sinan Ülgen, so we can get a little bit of perspective from Turkey, someone as a former Turkish diplomat and someone who has studied the S-400 negotiations very, very closely. So what is your take on the state of relations? And if you want to speak specifically to the S-400 as a tension point, we'd love to hear your views on that.
Yes, thank you, Lisel, and really congratulations for the SAIS team for putting together this panel. I'm sure it'll be interesting for us, but also for all those who have an opportunity to watch these discussions. Maybe I want to take, if you allow me, some liberty in answering your question and start from where Sibel Oktay left, which is that where do we go with this relationship, assuming there is political change in Turkey? Because I think that, you know, it is indeed now quite likely that we shall see political change. And therefore, to me, the more interesting question really is what we do then, because until then, as Aslı pointed out, there's actually very little room for any big moves, either on the Turkish side or the US side, I think positively or negatively. Therefore, the more interesting question really is, where do we go assuming there is political change? And there, I want to focus perhaps on four factors that have shaped the chemistry of this relationship in recent years. And there we need to be balanced. I mean, a lot of the discussion has perhaps rightly been on the wrongdoing on the Turkish side. But I think we have to, be also to talk. We have to also talk about what the US has done and not done in terms of, damaging this relationship. And there I do see those 4 points, 2 on the Turkish side and 2 on the US side. Let me start with the US side, because a lot has already been said on the Turkish side, although I'll come back to the S-400 issue towards the end. There are two, as I said, two main, damaging issues. One is the US relationship with the YPG. That, to many Turks, is a very sore point. It is at the root of a lot of the anti-Americans in Turkey, and it cuts across the board. So it's not something that is, proper to AK Party or its electorate. There's a very, big reaction to this, and a lack of comprehension about how is it that Turkey's major ally in NATO can work together with what Turkey sees as a terrorist organization. So therefore, even after political change, that particular issue is going to remain, and that needs to be addressed. Let's hope that it can be addressed more positively after political change than what has been done until now. The second point is the Gülen issue. Even assuming there is political change in Turkey, the incoming administration in Turkey will essentially have the same position on the Gülen issue as the current government. Because for those who will be in power, when you look at the composition of the opposition, the Gülenists are as much responsible for the degradation of the rule of law in Turkey as the current government. So therefore, the reaction of the US in terms of what they do with the Gülenists, the leniency or the pressure that they put on them, will also be seen as as a sign of goodwill or bad faith towards Turkey. Now, that's on the US side. Let's turn on the Turkish side. Democracy, rule of law is definitely one, big major item. And I tend to think, and I'd certainly like to hear the view of the panel on this one, that there is going to be some fast positive movement on that team, assuming there is political change in Turkey. At least if you actually listen to the statements by the opposition, they seem to sing to a similar tune, underlining the importance of redressing the rule of law in Turkey, of upgrading fundamental freedoms and democratic rights. Let's hope they deliver. On the S-400, now the S-400 is indeed a very, has become a very complex problem. There was actually a window of opportunity to settle this issue before Biden came to power. And here we're talking about, a year ago, where there were, some discussions about the formula that, where Turkey would keep the S-400, but nonetheless guarantee that they would not be used. They would be put in a box. The defense minister talked about the Crete formula, where it would be taken up only, as part of a joint decision, and so on. So my hope is that we can actually go back to that sort of formula, because the current wording in the NDAA of December 2020 is a very difficult political proposition for any Turkish leader, not just Erdoğan. That NDAA wording says seize possession of the S-400. And it's very difficult for any political leader to do that, having invested so far $1.3 billion in the system. So therefore, any flexibility that can be demonstrated towards a settlement of this very grave issue would certainly be very beneficial for the future of this relationship. And there, I would like to take reference the framework of negotiations that was held a year ago, that, to simplify it, it was about Turkey retaining possession of the S-400, but nonetheless, its use would be very heavily conditioned on a joint agreement about when it can be used, how it can be used, and so on. That, I hope, can be a formula for settlement for the S-400. Now, if the new Turkish administration and the US can actually address these four fundamental problems that have bedeviled the relationship, then I tend to be much more optimistic than what I heard on this panel. And despite geopolitical changes, dynamics in the region, reprioritization of US foreign policy, China containment, and so on, I still think that the Turkey-US relationship can cover a lot of ground, provided that we can address these four issues.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. We're starting to see some questions coming in from the audience. Please do go ahead and post those in the YouTube chat. They'll get forwarded to me, and I'll try to incorporate them into the discussion. I'll turn to Sinan Ciddi, who I think wants to respond. And Sinan, if you can, perhaps, I was also going to turn to you and kind of try to put current relations in historical context. I mean, is this the worst that we've ever seen relations? Is this symptomatic of previous problems and so forth? So please go ahead and go ahead with your response to Sinan Ülgen. But if you could comment on the historical context as well, please. Thanks.
Thank you. I didn't want to interject this quickly, but otherwise I just feel I'm going to forget with my increasingly senile mind or pandemic-induced senility. But just a quick reaction to my Adash Sinan is a very sort of nuanced, well-packaged sort of analysis, which puts things into good perspective. I would just maybe a point of disagreement slightly, but it harkens back to something that Seren said. And it really does put it into perspective. And it's a 35,000 foot of view of this Syria PYD YPG issue, right? Which I think goes to the heart of this poison relationship, right? That in addition to the Gulen factor, which should not be underestimated. But I have a slightly weird view on this. I'm not sure if it's weird, but what I would say is, I largely think that the Syria dispute between Turkey and the United States is a manufactured issue, right? The fact that the United States chose to work with the PYD, YPG in combating ISIS, which Turkey clearly identified as a terrorist offshoot of the PKK, which is fine. But if we look at the historical relationship between Turkey and the PYD, I mean, this was a pretty cordial relationship. As far as recently as 2010, Salih Muslim would be welcomed in Ankara with the red carpet rolled out for him. And I'll go even a step further. I would actually even say that even in the wake of the Syrian civil war, other than what to do with refugee flows, I would argue that Turkey essentially has no security interest in Syria, other than what Erdoğan has chosen in terms of land incursions for domestic politics, mobilization of troops for vote rallying at home. If you really wanted to eliminate the PYD-YPG issue as a security threat or a potential terrorism issue, he could have likely adopted something analogous or comparable to how Turkey dealt with the KRG in the mid-2000s, as in, let's settle this problem. What do we have? And establish a pretty robust diplomatic and military relationship, even as far as sending the prime minister and the defense minister or the chief of staff to actually meet with his Kurdish counterparts. They didn't do that. They went for actually securitizing problem, which was not a security issue. And I'll go even a step further with the ISIS front. Turkey never prioritized the fight against ISIS. It was a prioritization to topple the Assad regime, right? Whereas the United States' position was, I need to essentially get rid of this ISIS problem. Who's with me? Are you willing to work with me? And at best for Turkey, that was just an annoyance who prioritized regime change. So that's just the problem. As far as the second question, Lisa, thank you. Yeah, I can't, they've been sort of, I like to think in classes like the Turkish-American bilateral relationship throughout the Cold War, but even post-Cold War times has been a sort of cyclical, ups and downs, ebbs and flows, Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cyprus imbroglio in the 1970s, but also, the Gulf Wars, it really sort of constrained and sort of beleaguered the bilateral relationship. But I will always say, it never fundamentally resulted in a loss and breach of trust to this level, right? When we had crises and spats in the past, we had institutional engagements whereby either diplomats behind the scenes or military to militaries would work the problem because we invested sort of what I would say is a significant amount of capital in maintaining and proliferating this relationship. Deinstitutionalization on the part of Turkey in the last 4 years especially has really, I would say, irrevocably resulted in that loss of trust. I don't know how you go about building that. That's very difficult. And also there is I would agree with Sinan on this one, in terms of where the US lays the blame. The Trump administration was not helpful in terms of, an institutional approach to Turkey. Things like, I'll destroy your economy by former President Trump. It just didn't help, But deinstitutionalization and fundamental breach of trust are these things you necessarily can't sort of re-engage with a change of administration in Turkey or thereabouts. And as far as President Biden's concerned, it's worth just underscoring the fact that he doesn't meet with Mr. Erdoğan or really significantly engage with any of his sort of cabinet officials to a limit to any significant degree, but the sidelines of NATO meetings or other sort of international arenas. It's fundamentally a reflection of he does not want to talk to him unless he really has to, and that says a lot. Thanks.
I want to actually pick up on that point of the personal relationship between Biden and Erdoğan, or perhaps lack thereof. And I want to go back to Aslı, because you had mentioned this at the beginning, sort of what is the nature of the relationship between Biden and Erdoğan? Did Erdoğan look at Biden coming in as the opportunity to turn over a new leaf, or did he see this as kind of the loss of the bromance, I think, as you mentioned it? To what extent are personal relationships shaping the US-Turkey relations at this point?
I think President Erdoğan really wants to shape Turkish foreign policy through the prism of his personal interactions with leader. And the ideal model for him is the type of relationship he has with Putin. That is to say, whenever there's a problem, I pick up the phone and call Putin. Or when there is, when we need to sort out Syria, or when we need to talk about Caucasus, we meet each other and face to face, one-on-one in the room. This is exactly what he would like. It's close to the type of relationship he had with Trump. It's nothing like what he has with Biden, nothing like what President Biden is willing to engage in. And I think Sinan has talked about it, the deinstitutionalizing that's clearly President Erdoğan's preferred way. And we've even seen a recent example of this. By his own account, he said he wanted to meet with Biden at G20 one-on-one, tete-a-tete, and that President Biden wanted to have their teams in the room, meaning Secretary Blinken and I think his other members of his cabinet. So there is, but this does tell us how he wants to structure Turkish foreign policy, sort of a reflection of the, if I could use that word, one-man regime that has been created here with the consolidated, after his consolidation of power, following the 2017 referendum. That is really an extension of foreign policy, is that he gets to run, he gets to meet with Biden, he gets to be the only person that engages. It's very hard to do that, to reduce the Turkish-US relationship with its sort of multi-layers, decades of history and multiple layers, to just the conversation between two men. That you have the military to mill conversation, you have State Department, you have other issues that keep up. But the way things are working in Turkey right now, I think everyone's resigned to the fact that in dealing with some of the key bilateral issues, there's no parliament, there's no institutions, there's no establishment or bureaucracy that can take these decisions, and it's President Erdoğan. So Erdoğan's counterparts, I think, do not like this very personalized approach, but have come to understand that that's how he would prefer in running Turkey. We don't know anything about the chemistry between the two. They both can be charming in person and probably really try to sort of put up a more of a sort of a collegial face when they're in the same room together. But we do know what they feel about each other from their previous statements. Biden has made his position on Turkey and on Erdoğan pretty clear in his famous New York Times editorial board interview before the elections, before the US elections. There's no indication or no reason for him to change that view. And President Erdoğan has also been concerned about, he's made clear his preference for Trump win, and he's also been concerned about Turkish-US relations. But ever the pragmatist, when it looked like the White House was cold shouldering Turkey, not picking up the calls, not reaching out, not engaging, etc., the first 6 months, President Erdoğan did not use this occasion to lash out. Instead, he took a somewhat conciliatory tone when White House recognized 1915 Armenian genocide and moved on. So he can be very pragmatic, and I think that makes things easier. And there's no denying right now, there's no mistaking the fact that he wants to have a good rapport with Biden. And from a US angle, I think the question must be, is probably, okay, so Erdoğan wants to have good relations with us. How does it help further US goals or US interests or US demands, etc.? And that bit is not that clear. I think, the sort of, what the two sides want from each other is still not even transactional, because the lists are very detached. And I think that is, Sibel has pointed out the importance of S-400s for Congress and US system. For Turkey, it is clearly for President Erdoğan, it's important to have a sort of a visibility with Biden, to be able to demonstrate to Turkish public opinion and international public opinion that he gets along with the US president, etc. But the demands and the sort of goals are very distant from one another, which is why they're having a hard time taking this further other than meetings and then meetings. I'm sure there will be another meeting 6 months from now. What good that does is quite unclear.
I think this point about diplomacy is a really important one in terms of sort of what does foreign policy look like and what potential domestic gains, for example, might Erdoğan be able to garner by getting FaceTime with Biden. We know that there was a lot of talk about how long his meetings last, and they lasted longer than expected and so forth. The sort of posturing about the persona non grata of the ambassadors and so forth. We have 2 new ambassadors. We will have new ambassadors, both on the Turkish and the US side. Sinan mentioned already Murat Marjan, who's now in DC. Sibel, I want to turn to you on this with your study of diplomacy. Sort of how important are these public-facing relations? What can we read from them? And sort of how can we understand the importance of diplomacy for Erdoğan in terms of foreign policy, but also in terms of the domestic policy audiences?
Right. Excellent question with several layers. So hopefully I'll be able to peel them off one by one. But so a couple of things going off of what Aslı said about, these personal relationships. I think it matters a lot more for Turkey than it does for the US. Precisely because of this one-man show that Turkey has been putting on for especially the last 4 years, right? Everything sort of contracts to the top, which is occupied by Erdoğan. And so I think that kind of like face-to-face diplomacy, I guess ever since Obama and Erdoğan were out on the Rose Garden several years ago, and rain was pouring down and they were sharing an umbrella, and even that was like a major thing for pro-Erdoğan constituencies, right? Oh, look at this lovely relationship between these 2 guys and so on. So I think that kind of personal FaceTime and relationship and all these like photo ops, I think that matters. I want to say probably too much to the point of becoming just these opportunities to show up with no substance to show for it. So I think that's number one. With that being said, I do believe that diplomacy is fundamentally important, because the idea of having these relationships and these diplomatic maneuvers is to find areas of compromise and areas of reconciliation, as opposed to sort of constant posturing and challenging each other on these major issues like Gülen. We didn't talk about that yet, but Halkbank and sanctions busting and S-400 and F-16s and everything else. So I think diplomacy is important. One of the things that we saw, as you mentioned, Liesl, was just last month about this, about US ambassador along with 9 or 10 other ambassadors from European countries releasing a statement on Osman Kavala and his arbitrary detention without trial for the last 4 years, which is absurd. And a grave violation of human rights, and Erdoğan subsequently calling them, declaring these ambassadors, including the US ambassador, persona non grata, and threatening to expel them from Ankara. For those of you in our audience who haven't been able to follow this diplomatic spat, within a few days of Erdoğan's threats, these group of ambassadors released a joint statement saying that we abide by the Geneva Convention, which stops or prevents diplomats from meddling in the domestic affairs of sovereign states in which they're stationed. The funny thing about that particular episode was how there were these 2 different short statements released both in English and Turkish. And I think that's exactly where diplomacy starts to really sort of shine through and show you how you can skillfully maneuver these tricky situations, if you will, so that you don't, put more, throw more fuel onto the fire. What happened in that joint statement was these two different ways of talking about what happened. The English statement basically said that the US and these signatories continue to maintain their adherence to the Geneva Convention. The Turkish one said something slightly different and slightly geared towards placating the Turkish government and the Turkish public, which was, we pledged to abide by the clauses of the Geneva Convention. And so that kind of subtle difference is really, to me, was a masterclass in diplomacy, because you're controlling the narrative as the United States. You are sort of releasing these two statements that that controls the narrative both sort of internationally and also for Turkish domestic politics. You placate the Turkish government without compromising your own position on Kavala's arbitrary detention and his violation of human rights. And so that quickly died down after that, and everyone claimed a win, right? So Erdoğan's base claimed that this was a major win for them, and for Erdoğan, everybody else who were, skeptical of Erdoğan and Turkish government said, no, this is exactly why the US is sort of a master of diplomacy in this case, where they were able to cater to Turkish domestic without compromising their own position. So I think these kinds of maneuvers are precisely those instances that stop Turkey and US going sort of down the hill and crashing into a wall, basically. But I do think that there are much bigger issues that both countries have to grapple with, and these are the kind of sort of side dishes that keep that keep the relations going. But we obviously have to go back to those four sticking points that Sinan Ülgen mentioned. Gülen, American behavior in Syria, the S-400s, and I would want to add democracy and human rights violations in Turkey.
I appreciate that very much. Kind of seeing these exit ramps at the last minute. How do we manage this relationship? Okay, but we still have these fundamentally big issues to deal with. And you mentioned Halkbank as well. So I do got a couple questions in the chat on that. So Sinan Ciddi, I want to go back to you because you had brought up the issue of Halkbank earlier. Sort of what role does that play in the US-Turkey relationship? What are we talking about in terms of this sanctions busting and Turkey cooperating with Iran and so forth? And how big of an issue is that, say, for Congress's view of Turkey, as you mentioned earlier?
I think it's pretty significant. I mean, the Halkbank case is, in a nutshell, is a violation of US sanctions imposed upon Iran, whereby Turkey breached that surreptitiously in terms of essentially getting cheap natural gas or illicit natural gas and other fossil fuels imported into Turkey and paying the Iranians in essentially gold. And it seems to implicate the highest echelons of the Turkish government, as well as the Erdoğan family himself. Some of the main perpetrators have fled, and one of the main architects of the sanctions busting scheme, the overhead, Reza Zarrab, a joint Turkish-Iranian citizen, is now in the United States, and he was one of the chief witnesses for the prosecution. It's significant because there are layers to this. In that Halkbank is, it was overseen, the trial of it in the Southern District of New York, which is the kingmaker of politicians and political careers in the United States, and it really does demonstrate the extent of U.S. judicial power should they want to exercise it. Right, under the Trump administration, the prosecutor, the SDNY, the Southern District of New York, the prosecutor was essentially muzzled and subsequently fired by Trump because He wanted to see the conclusion of the Halkbank trial to its natural conclusion, which would have resulted in likely heavy fines against Halkbank, possibly leading to its implosion, but also significant loss of economic and investor confidence in the Turkish economy. So the knock-on effect, second, third, fourth order events was seen to be quite significant. Now, prosecutors at these federal levels change with administrations. So we do have a new prosecutor at the Southern District of New York. The Biden administration's perspective on that is essentially give the court and give the court its full day in court, so to speak, and let him rule. I think the president is likely aware, what would happen if Halkbank was fined to the magnitude of what some analysts suspect in the billions of dollars range. But given currency sort of jingoism right now, the knock-on effects could be quite significant. But I'd have to say, if this were normal times, just that saga on its own would be seen as quite a huge bilateral sort of spat and dispute, which would undermine or sort of question the nature of the relationship. But given the number of multiple crises that are occurring and the frequency at which they're occurring, we've kind of forgotten about this now, because the other highlight event was what we were talking about. I mean, think about it. 10 ambassadors were about to be discussed, labeled as persona non grata. I haven't checked this, but someone probably should. In the history of diplomacy since the signing of Westphalia, has any state threatened to expel 10 ambassadors in one go? I honestly don't think so. But it speaks to another issue that we probably need to bring to the surface, which is people working on Turkey, such as ourselves here or other sort of colleagues that do an admirable job. At some level, we seem to be over-intellectualizing what's happening in Ankara, in the sense that we probably need to talk about how cognitively, disassociated and incapacitated President Erdoğan is, right? I mean, this is a dangerous sort of position that we exist in. We are not dealing with a rational actor, other than the fact that he's interested in regime preservation and seat maintenance. He is completely out of touch with reality. He had an argument with one of his close colleagues or cabinet officials, I believe, the other day, when they were basically saying to him that the real rate of inflation in Turkey was really taking a toll on the public in terms of price increases, which were about 50% consumer price index. And he basically retorted at him saying that I know the people better than you don't know anything. But also threatening to expel 10 ambassadors because, for whatever reason, and that was an interesting thing that Sibel said, the international community basically pointed out to him that notions of human rights, right, stopped being a matter of domestic sovereignty, probably at the end of the Cold War. And that was a polite way of reminding them through the joint statement that was issued by the State Department, which subsequent embassies tweeted. So we have to bring this notion of, let's decouple ourselves from foreign policy analysis and just look at the situation that exists in Ankara, whereby we're probably looking at a significantly unstable President Erdoğan, and not necessarily a person who has all his marbles together in order to be able to make calculated and purposeful decisions as head of state.
I think you bring up a number of really important points, particularly with Halkbank and the concerns for the effects of any particular decision on the Turkish economy. You mentioned inflation. Obviously, we saw the central bank cut interest rates again today. I mentioned unorthodox monetary policy earlier. We've seen the Turkish lira hit a new low again. So I'm going to want to go in just a little bit to Aslı on sort of the role of the economy. What does that look like, and how does that shape in any way Turkey's foreign policy calculations? I want to go to Seren on more on the democracy concerns, particularly in terms of challenges the opposition may face from the government in the elections that are scheduled for 2023. We're getting some questions on that. Possibly also if you could focus on some of the particular strategies that have been used against mayors at the local level in terms of sort of cracking down on opposition gains. But I want to turn to Sinan Ülgen, because we've got lots of questions on the S-400 and the F-16s. And, does Turkey have a plan B if the F-16, if they're request to have F-16s is denied, has Turkey kind of closed off its options for future negotiations with the United States over defense purchases because of the S-400? If you could kind of give us your sense of your take on that issue.
Yes, the S-400 decision has been a very costly decision for Turkey. And here I'm not talking about the $1.3 billion that was sunk into the system, but it's been costly politically, it's been costly militarily, it's been costly also because of the CAATSA sanctions. So whichever way you look at it, it's a difficult decision to rationalize, except by saying that, it was an utterly political decision. It makes no sense otherwise. It doesn't help Turkey's national security. It doesn't help Turkey's military stature. It doesn't help Turkey's air defenses. It doesn't help Turkey's, industry. But it was a political decision, which ultimately Erdoğan believed that this was the right decision given his relationship with Putin. That's the only framework of analysis that makes sense when you look at the S-400. Now, looking forward, in terms of where this has, landed us, it has landed us in a place that is now very difficult firstly for the Turkish Air Force, because the Turkish Air Force relied on the F-35 platform in terms of its generational change. And this was a long-term project. Turkey became part of the F-35 consortium back in 2008. And the planning was that Turkey would acquire the F-35 and also gradually, in parallel, build up its own domestic fighters, which would ultimately replace the F-16s. That was the plan. Now, looking at that plan, the core part of that plan, which is the acquisition of the F-35 platform, is now gone. Can it be, sort of revitalized? I hope that, if we tackle the S-400 issue constructively, it can be revitalized, except for the fact that Turkey was not only a customer of the F-35 program. It was, an industrial partner of the F-35 program. And I think that unfortunately, there is no going back to the industrial cooperation side, because the manufacturers have now found alternative suppliers, and it's very difficult after a while to go back to that program on those grounds. So I think, with the exception of the industrial cooperation part, maybe in the future, Turkey could become a customer of the F-35. Now, where does F-16, and certainly the recent ask by the Turkish government for a package of modernized F-16s and modernization kits fall in this? The F-16 was, I think, a joint idea between the Turkish side and the American side, the administration. I think it would be naive to think that this came out of the blue, that Turkey decided to make this request. I think there has been some, behind doors consultations between the two, and Turkey made this request. I may be mistaken, but I tend to see that there is support for this request on the US side as well. It is rightly seen as as one way to build some positive momentum in the relationship, given all the problematic areas that we discussed. But of course, the outcome of which is not preordained, because even if the negotiations between the Turkish government and the US administration come to fruition, and we end up with an agreement about what sort of package will be delivered, what will be the budget, and so on, ultimately, whether this package will be green-lighted by Congress is an open question. Right now, it looks like it's going to be quite an uphill battle to get congressional approval. But I'll go back here to my first frame of analysis. I also think that because it is naive to think that this is just, Turkish unilateral action. I think that the administration believes that it can actually ultimately convince Congress that this should be green lighted. On what grounds? Well, at least on two grounds. The first one would be that if this is not delivered to Turkey, then on NATO's southern flank, you'll end up with a country that will be greatly handicapped in the future in terms of its air power deterrence. And secondly, to preempt any new overtures, towards Russia. And here, indeed, there are statements coming out from Ankara that if this package is not delivered, then Turkey will have no other option but to seek alternatives. And here it's mostly Russian alternatives, which will then trigger yet another cycle of political escalation between Turkey and the US. So I think on those grounds, there might be a scope for ultimately, having this package approved, which will help to some extent with the modernization needs of Turkey. But let's say it again, the F-16 is not an alternative to the F-35. The fact that Turkey has been excluded from the F-35 program, at least until now, is going to be a big handicap for the future of the Turkish Air Force, especially since countries in the region, Greece has made a request, UAE request has just been granted, if I'm correct. Many of the countries are now getting these the fifth generation airplanes to boost their air superiority, and Turkey will not be able to do that.
I'm really glad that you mentioned the production issue. This is why this is such a puzzle for me, because as I understand, one of the main reasons of choosing the S-400 was the possibility of co-production and technology transfer, because Turkey was so interested in developing its domestic defense industry. And so, to be kicked out of the production line of the F-35 is such a huge blow. So I appreciate you mentioning that. So I'm going to actually ask a really quick follow-up. And if Sinan, is that a two-finger on this question?
I just want to make a very brief point to Sinan, and I'll be quiet. I agree with his analysis, what the implications for NATO would be, except to say that for Congress to sort of rule or see this in Turkey's favor in terms of providing the F-16 or authorizing it, it would require a considerable amount of heavy lifting by the president here at this point. A lot of investment of political capital, and I'll tell you, he's not going to do that. He's not going to move on it. They're facing down China. There's a considerable mobilization of resources and strategizing towards China. Not least of all, they don't know necessarily what to do with Russia. The most they could do, and I would advise this, they could make a bold gesture. Get rid of the S-400 to our satisfaction, and we'll see what we can do about F-35s. Put it back in Turkey's court and see what Turkey does with it. But other than that, Biden will not expand political capital in foreign. He's got too much trouble at home. He's wasted a lot of capital on trying to get two domestic mammoth bills through. He's got one through, the other one's uncertain, but he doesn't have a lot of wiggle room in Congress right now to go on sort of foreign policy adventures relating to Turkey. But I understand Sinan's point about what it would mean for NATO power not to have sort of updated planes. Thanks.
I appreciate that point. Sibel, you had a two-finger?
I just wanted to say that I fully agree with Jide on this. I think it's a very tough battle for Biden, which I don't think he's incentivized enough to fight.
Yeah. So then this brings up the really important question, and this is my quick follow-up to Sinan Ülgen, and then I'll turn to Aslı and Seren, is that while Biden might not want to expend the political capital, and I agree with everything Sinan Jide said about, the domestic issues that he has, he's got the, midterms that we're thinking about. There's the blowback from the withdrawal from Afghanistan and so forth. So given all that, the US is still incredibly concerned about Turkey's, with what some are calling sort of a rapprochement with Russia, or kind of moving closer to Russia and so forth. To what extent is that a real concern, Sinan Ülgen, from your perspective?
Real concern for who?
So
for
to what extent do you believe that Turkey really is moving closer to Russia with on defense, on energy, on access to Syrian airspace? We see all of these things that Russia's been able to provide that the US can't. In DC, there's a grave concern, and within NATO more broadly, about Turkey getting closer to Russia and what that means for the alliance, what that means for global security and so forth. So how valid do you think those concerns are?
I think that there's a big exception, and that's the S-400. But if you take the S-400 issue out of the equation, the rest of the Turkey-Russia relationship is not, that is not something that should be viewed under the same light. Because Turkey and Russia are, at the end of the day, they are, in the same region. They have common concerns. We've seen how, cooperation in Syria, which initially these two countries had backed very different outcomes in Syria. But because of Western inaction, particularly European inaction, but also US indecisiveness, let's remember after the chemical, use of chemical weapons, Obama's decision not to strike back. So Turkey ended up with two partners that are not natural partners for Turkey, Iran and Russia. But the type of modalities that were developed in Syria between Turkey and Russia in terms of negotiations, conflict resolution, were then transposed to other theaters. We see that in Libya, even though again in Libya, those countries backed different factions, to some extent in Karabakh. But having said that, Turkey and Russia do not see eye to eye on many other regional issues. Ukraine, for instance, where Turkey has certainly not recognized the illegal annexation of Crimea, but even above and beyond that, Turkey has been supplying armed drones to Ukraine, which has raised the ire of Putin himself. So the relationship is very complex between Turkey and Russia, and we certainly cannot talk about any sort of strategic alignment between Turkey and Russia. Having said that, I am, should we be concerned about, if there's if the Turkish demand for F-16s is not green lighted, that Turkey can, can turn to pivot to Russia? Yes, I think we should be concerned. Not because this would be the natural outcome, but because as the S-400 decision has demonstrated, decision-making in Turkey about foreign policy issues has been deinstitutionalized. So us who have been brought up to think in, or to analyze things within a rational frame, we have difficulty in explaining decisions like the S-400. So if that has happened, with all the costs that has entailed, there is no particular reason to think that, Turkey would not go and seek, to purchase Russian planes down the road, even though the costs attached to those decisions would be very high. So I wouldn't totally rule that out. I don't think it's very likely. But I can't rule it out anymore, having seen the S-400 decision.
I think this point about the deinstitutionalization of foreign policy, and then some of the, concerns about Erdoğan's decision-making, the individuals that he perhaps has kind of insulated himself with and so forth, that Sinan Cidi was referring to earlier, I think is so important. The sort of purging of the foreign ministry, the moving away from, those who have a professional institutional background in doing foreign policy and kind of shifting who's doing the foreign policy making, I think is a really important point. So I appreciate you.
Just one thing. I mean, the Foreign Service, there certainly has been a purge, but that was, based to the Gülenists. And I think the Foreign Service still today is the institution in Turkey that has retained its institutional integrity.
On a relative scale. Yeah, I would agree with you. And Aslı, you had actually brought up this point as well in terms of talking about the deinstitutionalization of foreign policy. But I want to turn to you on this question of the economy. Obviously today, Turkey observers are all a Twitter about what's going on with the economy. But we've seen, real concerns in terms of inflation and unemployment and so forth, pushing for growth at all costs, it seems. Sort of what's your take on the state of economy, and does that shape foreign policy calculations? We know, for example, that one of the reasons that Turkey may have chose the S-400, in addition to the domestic defense industry considerations, was that Russia had offered a major loan. So there's economic considerations shaping a lot of these foreign policy decisions. So what's your sort of take on that?
Thank you, Lisselle. It is a sad day indeed, because I think we're past that point when economic decisions and sort of bad decisions could be reversed. I think we are in a free fall right now, and perhaps today marks the sort of the last day when things could have been reversed. Just to give you some figures, a minimum wage, and there are quite a few people in this country, millions of people who earn minimum wage, is about $255. For a reference, when Turkish economy was doing good, it was around 600 euros back in the days of the Turkish EU accession process. $255 is pretty much impossible to live on, even in Turkey. Yes, the lira has been depreciating. Yes, Turkey is cheaper, but this is an impossible figure, which is why economic worries are at the heart of people's grievances. This is perhaps the primary reason the primary reason for Erdoğan facing a significant anti-Erdoğan majority today. The economic decisions are all about preferences about the way you want to shape your country and the way you want to see your society. Part of the huge and it's not easy to ruin Turkish economy. You really have to try hard for a long enough time consistently. Why? Because Turkey in itself is a big market, big country, self-sufficient, and has a fairly large production base with sort of a capable workforce. So, but we've had a consistent stream of bad decisions that have been taking place over the last few years. Obviously, we've talked about personalized decision making, and in the foreign policy arena. But when it comes to economy, it tends to be something that destroyed investor confidence. And I don't mean just investor confidence as in foreign investors. This is a country that relies on foreign direct investment, but I'm not just even referring to that. Majority of Turks have kept their savings in foreign currency. And there's no more any confidence from Turkish investors to invest in their country. Unemployment is high. Youth unemployment is extremely high, 35 plus. Inflation, the figures are debatable. Officially 20%, but food inflation is 30%. Raw materials, it's even higher, for 40 plus, and the sort of independence of economic institutions, which was at the heart of economic reforms back in 2001 with the IMF program and Kemal Dervish and so on and so forth, at the heart of Turkey's success story in the economy, are now all destroyed. And I think this point is very important. But it's not only that. I mean, and I'm not going into sort of, controversial decisions such as, selling off central bank reserves to keep the Turkish lira at a certain level, which means to this day, state coffers are empty. But what is very important here is preferences about how you want to run the economy and preferences about where you want to spend your money. I've heard Sinan and Sibel and others. Sinan talked about F-16, F-35, so on and so forth, and they are all right, but they're all right in their assessment. But at the end of the day, Turkey prefers to spend 20% of its budget for 2022 on military spending. This is a staggering figure. This is a staggering figure that you do not see in any in sort of anywhere in Europe. You have to really, really beg and convince and plead and cry and threaten European countries and countries that are high in the sort of in global indexes to go up to 2% in their military spending. And we all know that Trump has been threatening Europeans to go up to 2%. So Turkey's spending 20%, and yes, F-16s and drones are great, and F-35, S-400, this, that, but it is an incredible figure when you have people struggling below the poverty line. Add to that the sort of the more ostentatious state structure, state spending that you see in some areas of the government, and then the big infrastructure projects that are driven, that are run, that are based on the idea that, you know, when the economy is tough, you need to have big government spending in order to resuscitate the economy. And there is a certain logic to it. But when you take away the competitiveness of the sector, of the industry, the sort of the more, bring in a crony capitalism of sorts into this, whereby the same 4, 5, 6 companies get all the contracts, everything, then it does tend to look bad for the voters. In other words, they do start building their, resentment on that. When economy is good, people don't really care that much about crony economy, crony capitalism, or even corruption. This is not just Turkey, it's elsewhere as well. But when you are struggling below the poverty line with a minimum wage, which is $260, the fact that the same company keeps getting millions and millions of dollars of government contracts on a daily, you know, on a sort of a monthly basis does look bad. So I guess I have not given you a very academic answer, but I can say that this is all that anyone's talking about in Turkey. You do know from having spent time here, Lisal, how focused people are on the currency and foreign currency, and how the dollar is, you know, the ratio of the dollar to the Turkish lira, and the depreciation of the Turkish lira, the devaluation rather, is actually has now become a daily source of tension in politics too, bringing the question of whether or not the government will be forced to have early elections. Under normal circumstances, any government facing this much pressure from the street and from politics and from the opposition would have to call for early elections. But Turkey is not a sort of a truly going through normal circumstances, in the sense that it's not really a country that exercises full democratic, that allows for the exercise of full spectrum of democratic rights. And therefore, I'm not sure about early elections, whether or not they will take place, but poll numbers are pretty clear that President Erdoğan is facing an anti-Erdoğan majority. And, you know, it is looking, with today's decision, very difficult for him to muddle through, unless, you know, what Turkey needs is a drastic decision to return to a rules-based economy and a very strict economic program. But I've seen no indication that anyone in Ankara, or at least, I shouldn't say that, but anyone at least in the presidency is interested in that.
And exactly on that point, I want to turn to Seren on the elections, on the challenges that the opposition faces. We know we have these massive, economic grievances, in addition to the human rights concerns and other grievances that you mentioned earlier, Seren. Can you give us a sense of the challenges that the opposition is facing looking towards the 2023 elections? If we have this much discontent, shouldn't it be a shoo-in that the opposition should be able to secure a victory? What kind of challenges do they face?
Thanks, Liesl. Maybe I can briefly reflect what my colleagues said as well before replying your question, because actually, we have all defined different crises: economic crisis, foreign policy crisis, and domestic crisis, human rights crisis in Turkey. But I try to understand all these challenges within the regime and system dynamics. So I can say that we have a systemic crisis in Turkey. So the presidential system was promoted by the AKP, actually gave huge power to Erdoğan. But on the other hand, this system makes Erdoğan more vulnerable. That's what we have actually. So this is one issue. And the second issue is that, by the way, can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly. Yeah,
okay,
the video is
okay.
frozen, but your audio is fine. Thank you.
That's perfect. Another issue that system brings is that the system, the presidential system, actually encourages the opposition to come together, because Erdoğan is always enjoyed with the divided opposition. Now the opposition parties come together and they began to set the agenda for the future. So it's very important to hear their foreign policy vision, their economic vision, but also their democratic vision for the country. And they have in somehow learned to express their willingness to actually create a stable democracy for Turkey. So this is, I think, an unintended consequences of the presidential system initiated by Erdoğan, because all of this personalization and the institutionalization process actually created an economic and political problems in the country, and the opposition in the country actually, despite of their all differences, which lays behind the historical rifts of Turkey, actually tried to come together. When we look at these opposition parties, they lay actually on the ground of left-right division, Kurdish-Turkish division, and also secular and religious division. But they intended to come together to create a straightened parliamentary system as an alternative system to this presidential system. This is one important issue. And second issue is that actually opposition, especially the National Alliance formed by CHP, İYİ Party, Saadet Partisi, and Democrat Party, actually gained the local elections, so that they keep the big cities, major cities like Istanbul, Ankara, and under this economic actually crisis, people suffering their everyday life. So we can see that all these municipalities can respond their needs with their social assistance programs and with their actually new kinds of forms to create solidarity between citizens. So they in somehow try to reply citizens' needs. That is why I think the opposition has a chance to show their capability to rule for the future of country. And also, despite all of the disinformation used by the government media and their social media trolls, these problems in the everyday life actually makes people to listen more, to more open to listen other figures in the opposition. And I think all of the good and positive messages given by the opposition actors created a kind of actually hope in the country. That's why I think I see the opposition as advantages, but it's also another kind of actually unintended consequence pushed by the presidential system itself in Turkey. And now I think the most important issue in Turkey, first of all, the change of the government to actually create more stable relations, both in the foreign policy and but stable economy and stable domestic policy. And also this presidential system, as we mentioned, actually demolished all bureaucratic chains and created a loyalty-based bureaucracy in the country. That's why we suffer this kind of economic and foreign policy crisis, and also crisis in every aspect of the life. And in Turkey, people always wait what will be next tomorrow, actually. That's why it's the actually dark side of the issue, but I think the opposition has more capability to actually gain in the next election, but also it's a long way, and they have to actually somehow be more creative and actually keep their united position. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I want to give the last word to Sibel. So we've just heard about how the current circumstances, the presidential system may have created conditions that brings the opposition together. We know that the role of nationalism has been quite powerful. Sinanjidi earlier kind of talked about how Turkey's military operations in Syria had a political dimension that creates nationalism, that brings people together. What do you think that the role of nationalism is going to play in the upcoming elections? Is Erdoğan going to be able to kind of harness that to bring people together? Will the opposition be fractured? Sort of any take that you have as someone who studies comparative politics so closely, and its role in foreign policy, of course, but sort of what's your take on the role of these issues in the upcoming election?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if this whole conversation is scripted, how naturally it flows from foreign policy to domestic politics and elections and everything. So I wanna make a few points in regards to what Sinanjidi said, as well as what Seren Korkmaz said prior to this. The securitization of foreign policy, securitization of Syria, and how it wouldn't have been this way was it not for domestic politics. And I think it's exactly right. I think the sole reason why Syria has been politicized and sort of securitized in the way that it has been is because it brings dividends in domestic politics for Erdoğan, and I'm speaking with his sort of alliance, this sort of weird, strange bedfellows kind of situation with Devlet Bahçeli and his Nationalist Action Party, the right-wing nationalist party in Turkey. I think Seren is more hopeful than myself, if I may say so, when she says, the opposition comes together and now the alliance between AKP and MHP is polling at about 45%. That's a minority, last I checked. And so that means the opposition has a chance of taking over, unless, well, for that we need to see electoral system being the same way that it is right now, but I'll come to that in a minute. But I don't think this opposition unity is strong enough. And by that, I mean, this opposition, were it to come to power, right? The Republican People's Party, the secular CHP, E Party under MHP's old Meral Akşener, and possibly the Kurdish HDP, they are one foreign policy crisis away from dissolving, because in this current security and defense situation, the regional security climate makes that coalition's future very precarious. Just, I think, was it last week, 2 weeks ago, when the parliament passed another war bill with AKP's support with E Party, which is actually CHP's ally in basically every other kind of policy area, and so I think security has become a wedge issue for Turkish opposition, And that's exactly why, yes, your goal could be to defeat Erdoğan, but when it comes to governing together, I think that's going to be a very difficult road for this potential replacement, this potential government that could replace Erdoğan. AKP's roadmap or playbook for 2023 has, I think, panic written all over it. MHP is polling at 7.4% right now. And Turkey has a national electoral threshold of 10%. So if MHP was to run on its own at the next election, it would be out of the parliament. And that's exactly why they're thinking all sorts of ways to revise the electoral system, everything from lowering the threshold to 7%, to gerrymandering, to changing district magnitudes, to eliminating the presidential runoff, to changing the threshold for selecting or electing a president from a 50+1 to a plurality. I want to go back to what Seren said about how the very system that Erdoğan and his administration or his right-hand people introduced is the very system that keeps him hostage and the very system that makes him vulnerable. Let's assume that an electoral reform passes and the president is now elected with a plurality. Do we not anticipate any other leader? I want to say Ekrem İmamoğlu, I want to say Mansur Yavaş, or any other person for that matter. Do we think that they won't be able to achieve 35% just like that at the snap of a finger? I think that's highly probable. And so I think Erdoğan is in a bind institutionally in terms of how to move forward. This has become his almost his cage that he built around himself. As far as future elections and how nationalism could influence the way forward, Turkey is still, like everyone on the panel has rightly pointed out, is still a very much nationalistic country with a majority of its population geared towards center-right. I think that's a major reason why AKP pivoted away from the Kurdish HDP around 2010-14, when that fallout became clear, when Demirtas said, we will never make you president. And then that, well, I'm not going to call it an alliance because that's too much of a strong of a word, but that kind of, cozy relationship kind of began falling apart. And so, and that's when AKP had to pivot to MHP. So I think that's still, I want to say, the only way in which, so nationalism is the only issue area or trend that Erdoğan can still rally much of the Turkish population around and behind. And that's why MHP is likely the only partner moving forward. But I want to go back and finish with the point that I made earlier about how security and defense is a wedge issue for the opposition. And so as long as AKP can fill its sails with the wind of that, then I think it's very difficult for the opposition to remain together, as we've seen with the war bill that was voted on earlier.
And then that all presumes that you have a government that accepts the results of the election, right? So all kinds of questions up in the air. And I really appreciate the point that you made about, identity politics being something that's sort of a useful last resort, given the state of the economy, given the grievances and so forth. Nationalism can be used as that rallying point. I want to thank everybody. We've gone over a little bit. We've got so many more issues that we could have covered if we'd had lots more time, but I really appreciate the input of all of the panelists. This has been an incredibly wide-ranging, but also I think very deep and insightful discussion. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for the questions. We were able to incorporate a good deal of them. So thank you for your participation, and keep watching Turkey because it's always going to be fascinating, frustrating and fascinating. All right. Thank you very much.